On June 9, 1982, something happened in the skies over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley that military historians still struggle to fully comprehend. In a single afternoon, the Israeli Air Force achieved what many considered impossible. 4 F-15 Eagles, using a controversial formation tactic that had been rejected by the IAF High Command just 18 months earlier, engaged wave after wave of Syrian MiG-21 fighters. When the sun set over the Mediterranean that evening, 23 Syrian aircraft lay scattered across the Lebanese countryside, their pilots either dead or captured, while not a single Israeli jet had been lost. This is not a story about superior technology, though the F-15 Eagle was indeed a remarkable aircraft. This is not simply a story about better training, though Israeli pilots were among the most skilled in the world. This is a story about one man's vision, his stubborn refusal to accept conventional wisdom, and the day when everything he had been fighting for was finally proven right. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Amir Nachumi, and the tactic the IAF rejected was called the four-ship ambush. If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you incredible true stories of courage, innovation, and human determination every week, and your support helps us continue telling these important narratives. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The year was 1980, and the Cold War was at its height. In the Middle East, tensions between Israel and Syria had been simmering since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. That conflict had been a wake-up call for Israel. The surprise attack launched by Egypt and Syria had nearly overwhelmed Israeli defenses, and in those desperate early hours, the Israeli Air Force had suffered devastating losses against Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles. The SAM systems deployed by the Arab nations weren't just dangerous, they were revolutionary. The SA-6 Gainful, in particular, had proven to be a game-changer. Israeli pilots who had grown accustomed to dominating the skies suddenly found themselves flying through corridors of death, where radar-guided missiles could reach out and destroy them from distances they had never before considered threatening. In the aftermath of that war, Israel embarked on an ambitious program to rebuild and modernize its air force. Central to this effort was the acquisition of America's newest and most advanced fighter jet, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle. The first F-15s arrived in Israel in December 1976, and they represented a quantum leap in capability over anything the IAF had previously operated. The F-15 was fast, capable of exceeding Mach 2.5 at high altitude. It was maneuverable, with a thrust-to-weight ratio that allowed it to accelerate while climbing vertically. Most importantly, it carried the most advanced radar and weapon systems in the Western world. The APG-63 radar could detect and track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 60 miles, and the AIM-7 Sparrow missiles it carried could engage those targets at distances that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. But having the best equipment in the world means nothing if you don't know how to use it properly. This is where Amir Nachumi enters our story. Born in 1951 in the coastal city of Haifa, Nachumi had wanted to be a pilot for as long as he could remember. Growing up in the shadow of Mount Carmel, he would watch the jets from Ramat David Air Base streak across the sky, their contrails painting white lines against the blue Mediterranean backdrop. While other children played soccer in the streets, young Amir would sit on his family's roof with a pair of binoculars, trying to identify each aircraft by its silhouette. He joined the Israeli Air Force in 1969, just 2 years after the Six-Day War, during which Israeli pilots had achieved one of the most decisive aerial victories in military history. The legends of that conflict loomed large over every young pilot who entered training. Names like Ran Ronan, Giora Epstein, and Iftash Spector were spoken with reverence in the briefing rooms and barracks. Nachumi proved to be an exceptional student. His instructors noted his unusual ability to think several moves ahead during air combat maneuvers, almost like a chess player anticipating his opponent's strategy. While other pilots focused on perfecting individual techniques, Nachumi was always thinking about the bigger picture. How did all the pieces fit together? How could you use the capabilities of multiple aircraft in coordination to achieve something none of them could accomplish alone? He earned his wings in 1971 and was assigned to a squadron flying the Dassault Mirage III, the French-built Delta Wing fighter that had been the backbone of Israeli air superiority during the Six-Day War. But by the time the Yom Kippur War erupted in October 1973, the Mirage was showing its age. Nachumi flew 37 combat missions during those desperate 20 days. He witnessed friends die in fireballs of burning jet fuel. He watched as experienced pilots, men he had looked up to and learned from, were shot down by missiles they never saw coming. And in the long nights between missions, when exhaustion and fear should have driven him to sleep, he found himself thinking obsessively about what they were doing wrong. The problem, he realized, wasn't just the enemy's missiles. The problem was that Israeli tactical doctrine hadn't evolved to account for them. The IAF was still fighting the way it had fought in 1967, with pilots operating as individual hunters, engaging targets one-on-one. This worked beautifully when your opponent was another fighter jet. It was suicidal when the sky was filled with radar-guided death. After the war ended, Nachumi began putting his thoughts on paper. He wrote detailed analyses of every engagement Hunmix had participated in or witnessed. He studied the tactics that had worked and, more importantly, the ones that had failed. He interviewed other pilots, gathering data points that he assembled into an increasingly clear picture of what needed to change. His conclusion was radical for its time. The era of the individual fighter ace, the lone wolf hunting through the clouds, was over. The future belonged to coordinated formations, where multiple aircraft worked together as a single integrated weapons system. Not just flying in the same general area, but executing precisely choreographed maneuvers that would confuse enemy radar operators, overwhelm their tracking capabilities, and create openings that no single aircraft could achieve on its own. He called his concept the four-ship ambush. The basic idea was simple, at least in theory. Instead of the traditional two-ship element that had been the foundation of fighter tactics since World War II, Nachumi proposed using 4 aircraft, operating as a unified team. 2 pairs of fighters would fly in a staggered formation with significant vertical and horizontal separation. When enemy aircraft were detected, the formation would not simply charge in for a head-on engagement. Instead, it would split and reform in a way that placed the enemy in an impossible tactical situation. The lead pair would engage the enemy directly, drawing their attention and forcing them to commit to a fight. Meanwhile, the second pair would use the distraction to maneuver into a flanking position, approaching from an angle where the enemy's radar cross-section was largest and their situational awareness was compromised. By the time the enemy pilots realized they were being ambushed from 2 directions, it would already be too late. But the genius of Nachumi's concept went beyond just the geometry of the engagement. He had thought deeply about how to exploit the specific capabilities of the F-15 and its weapon systems. The aircraft's radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, but only engage one at a time with its semi-active radar-guided missiles. This meant that coordination was essential. If 2 aircraft tried to engage the same target, they would waste a missile and create confusion. If they engaged separate targets but didn't time their shots correctly, the enemy might have time to react and evade. Nachumi developed precise timing protocols that he called the ambush sequence. Each pilot in the 4-ship formation had a specific role and a specific moment to act. The lead pilot would achieve radar lock first, but hold his fire, using his emissions to illuminate the target for the second pilot, who would launch the first missile. The moment that missile left the rail, the third pilot would begin his own targeting sequence, while the fourth maintained overall situational awareness, ready to call out any new threats or direct the formation's next move. It was complicated, it required extensive training, and perfect trust between all 4 pilots. And when Nachumi first presented it to his squadron commander in early 1981, it was immediately rejected. The commander's name was Colonel David Ivry, who would later go on to become one of the most distinguished officers in IAF history. But in 1981, Ivry was focused on a different problem. He was planning what would become known as Operation Opera, the daring raid that destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. His mind was occupied with the challenges of long-range strike planning, and he had little patience for what he saw as theoretical speculation about air-to-air tactics. Besides, the conventional wisdom within the IAF held that the F-15 was already so superior to anything the Syrians could field that complicated new tactics were unnecessary. In several small engagements since the jets had arrived, Israeli F-15s had consistently outperformed Syrian MiGs. Why fix what wasn't broken? Nachumi tried to explain that those engagements were not representative of what a real war would look like. In small-scale incidents, Israeli pilots had the advantage of time and preparation. They could choose when and where to engage, picking off isolated Syrian aircraft at their leisure. But in a full-scale conflict, the Syrians would launch dozens of jets simultaneously. They would swarm Israeli formations with numbers, hoping to overwhelm quality with quantity. Against such an assault, traditional tactics would fail. His warnings fell on deaf ears. Frustrated but undeterred, Nachumi continued to develop his concept. He found a small group of like-minded pilots who shared his vision, and they began practicing the four-ship ambush during training exercises, often without official authorization. They flew their missions after dark, when fewer eyes were watching. They used simulator time to rehearse the ambush sequence until they could execute it in their sleep. Among these pilots was a young captain named Dubi, whose real name remains classified to this day due to Israeli military censorship laws. Dubi was what other pilots called a natural stick. He had an intuitive feel for the aircraft that couldn't be taught, an almost supernatural ability to sense what his jet was doing and predict what it would do next. More importantly, he believed in Nachumi's vision with the fervor of a convert. There was also Lieutenant Ran, the youngest member of their informal group. Ran was barely 24 years old, with less than 500 hours in the F-15. But he possessed a quality that Nachumi valued above all else. He listened, he absorbed information like a sponge, asked intelligent questions, and never made the same mistake twice. In the ambush sequence, he would fly as the fourth ship, the position that required the broadest situational awareness but offered the fewest opportunities for glory. The fourth member of their core group was a pilot, everyone called Shimon, though that wasn't his real name either. Shimon was the oldest of the group, a veteran of the Yom Kippur War, who had seen friends die and had nearly died himself when a SAM exploded close enough to his Phantom to fill his cockpit with shrapnel. The scars on his face were a permanent reminder of that day, and they gave him a gravity that younger pilots found intimidating. But beneath that hard exterior was a man of deep conviction. He had seen what happened when doctrine failed to evolve. He would not let it happen again. These four pilots, along with a rotating cast of others who joined their unofficial training program, spent the next 18 months perfecting the four-ship ambush. They developed signals and procedures that allowed them to coordinate without extensive radio communication, which could be intercepted and jammed. They practiced transitioning from defensive to offensive postures in seconds. They learned each other's flying styles so intimately that they could anticipate what their wingmen would do before they did it. And then, in June of 1982, everything changed. The Lebanon War began on June 6th, when Israeli ground forces crossed the border in response to the assassination attempt on Israel's ambassador to Britain by Palestinian militants. The operation was initially called Peace for Galilee, and its stated objective was to push PLO forces back 40 kilometers from the Israeli border, placing the northern settlements beyond the range of rocket attacks. But from the very beginning, it was clear that this war would be different from the limited operations Israel had conducted in Lebanon before. Syrian forces had been deployed in the Bekaa Valley since 1976, supposedly as a peacekeeping force but effectively as an occupation army. They had brought with them a formidable air defense network, including the same SA-6 missiles that had caused such devastation in 1973. The Israeli High Command knew that any serious ground operation would eventually bring them into conflict with Syria, and they knew that the Syrian air defense network in the Bekaa Valley would have to be destroyed before Israeli aircraft could operate freely in support of ground forces. Planning for this operation had actually begun months earlier under conditions of extreme secrecy. The IAF had developed an audacious plan to destroy the Syrian SAM sites using a combination of innovative tactics, including remotely piloted drones, anti-radiation missiles, and precision-guided munitions. But destroying the SAM sites would only be the beginning. The moment those sites came under attack, the Syrian Air Force would scramble everything it had to defend them. Intelligence estimates suggested the Syrians had over 300 combat aircraft within range of the Bekaa Valley, including more than 200 MiG-21s. Even if only a fraction of those launched, Israeli pilots would face odds they had never encountered before. On the evening of June 8th, Nachumi was called to a briefing at IAF headquarters. When he arrived, he found himself in a room full of senior officers, including Colonel Ivry, who had since been promoted and now commanded the Air Force. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew that the next day would determine whether the war would be a swift success or a prolonged bloodbath. The briefing officer explained the plan. At precisely 1400 hours the following day, Operation Mole Cricket 19 would commence. The Syrian SAM sites would be attacked using a carefully orchestrated sequence of drone decoys, electronic jamming, and precision strikes. But the success of the entire operation depended on one critical factor. The Israeli fighters assigned to combat air patrol would have to hold off the Syrian Air Force long enough for the strike aircraft to complete their mission. Nachumi studied the maps and force projections. He felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. The patrol assignments called for standard two-ship elements spread across the engagement area in a loose, defensive screen. Against the expected Syrian response, it wasn't going to be enough. He raised his hand. Colonel Ivry looked at him with an expression that mixed curiosity and impatience. "What is it, Nachumi?" "Sir?" Nachumi said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "The patrol assignments won't work against the force levels we're expecting. The Syrians will overwhelm our pairs. We need to use concentrated four-ship formations." A murmur ran through the room. Ivry's expression hardened. "We've discussed your theories before, Lieutenant Colonel. The consensus is that they're impractical." "With respect, sir," Nachumi pressed on, "I have 4 pilots who have been practicing coordinated four-ship tactics for over a year. We can handle a much larger number of bandits than a series of isolated pairs. Let us prove it." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what Nachumi was asking for. He wanted permission to take his unofficial training program into combat, to test his unproven theories against real enemy fighters with the outcome of a major military operation hanging in the balance. Ivry stared at Nachumi for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "You have one chance," he said. "Don't waste it." Nachumi didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours reviewing every detail of the ambush sequence with Dubi, Ran, and Shimon. They went over the terrain, the expected Syrian approach vectors, the frequencies they would use, and the signals they would rely on when radio silence became necessary. By dawn, they had rehearsed every contingency they could imagine. At 800 hours, they gathered in the ready room at Ramat David Air Base. The same air base young Amir had watched from his rooftop decades earlier. The irony was not lost on him. The morning briefing confirmed what they had expected. Syrian forces had detected the Israeli buildup and were on high alert. Intelligence indicated that the Syrian Air Force had moved additional aircraft forward to bases near the Lebanese border. When Operation Mole Cricket kicked off, the response would be massive and immediate. Nachumi looked at his 3 wingmen. Dubi was calm, checking his flight gear with methodical precision. Shimon stared at the wall, his scarred face betraying no emotion. Ran was nervous, his leg bouncing involuntarily beneath the table, but his eyes were focused and determined. "Gentlemen," Nachumi said, "we've been waiting for this for a long time. Today we proved that everything we've worked for was worth it. Remember your training. Trust your wingmen. And when those MiGs come, we'll be ready." At 13:45 hours, the 4 F-15s taxied onto the runway at Ramat David. The afternoon sun beat down from a cloudless sky, its light reflecting off the distinctive gray and tan camouflage that Israeli aircraft wore. Around them, the base was a hive of activity. Strike aircraft were being armed with anti-radiation missiles and precision-guided bombs. Electronic warfare aircraft were warming up, their jamming pods. Everyone knew that within the hour, the largest air battle since the Yom Kippur War would begin. Nachumi's call sign that day was Eagle 1. Dubi was Eagle 2, Shimon was Eagle 3, and Ran was Eagle 4. They had chosen the name themselves, a tribute to the aircraft that had made their vision possible. The 4 F-15s lifted off in quick succession, their twin Pratt & Whitney engines pushing them skyward with a thunder that could be heard miles away. They climbed through 10,000 feet, then 20,000, forming up into the loose diamond formation that was the starting position for the four-ship ambush. At precisely 1400 hours, the first wave of remotely piloted drones crossed into Lebanese airspace above the Bekaa Valley. To Syrian radar operators, these small aircraft looked exactly like incoming Israeli fighters. They responded exactly as Israeli planners had predicted, activating their radar systems to track and engage the apparent threat. The moment those radars lit up, they signed their own death warrants. Israeli Wild Weasel aircraft, loitering just beyond missile range, launched their AGM-78 standard anti-radiation missiles. These weapons homed in on the radar emissions, following them back to their source with unerring accuracy. The first Syrian SAM site erupted in a ball of flame at 1403 hours. By 1410, a dozen sites had been destroyed, and then the Syrians launched their fighters. Eagle Flight was positioned at 32,000 feet, orbiting in a racetrack pattern over the mountains separating the coastal plain from the Bekaa Valley. Nachumi watched his radar screen intently, waiting for the first contacts to appear. They came faster than he had expected. Eagle 1, this is control. Nachumi's headset crackled with the voice of the ground-based radar operator. Multiple bandits, bearing 090, distance 80 miles, low altitude. Estimated formation, strength 20-plus aircraft, 20 aircraft. Against 4, 5-to-1 odds, at minimum. Nachumi keyed his microphone. Eagle Flight, this is Eagle 1. Execute ambush alpha. Acknowledge. Eagle 2, acknowledged. Eagle 3, acknowledged. Eagle 4, acknowledged. The formation began to move. Eagle 1 and Eagle 2 turned east, descending toward the oncoming threat. Eagles 3 and 4 turned north, maintaining altitude, positioning themselves for the flanking maneuver that was the heart of Nachumi's concept. The Syrian pilots were flying MiG-21s, the venerable delta-wing fighters that had been the backbone of Soviet-aligned air forces for 2 decades. The MiG-21 was fast and maneuverable, but it had limited radar capability, and its weapons were optimized for close-range engagements. Against the F-15's ability to detect and engage targets at extreme range, the MiG pilots would be at a severe disadvantage if they could be caught before they closed the distance. At 40 miles, Nachumi achieved radar lock on the lead, Syrian formation. There were at least 12 aircraft in the first wave, flying in a loose gaggle that suggested either poor discipline or a deliberate attempt to present a confusing picture to Israeli radar. Probably both. He held his fire, just as he had practiced 100 times before, waiting. At 30 miles, Dubi launched the first missile. The AIM-7 Sparrow dropped from his wing pylon, its rocket motor igniting with a bright flash visible even in the afternoon sunlight. It streaked eastward, covering the distance to its target in under a minute. The first Syrian MiG never knew what hit it. One moment, its pilot was scanning the horizon for Israeli aircraft. The next, 300 pounds of high explosive and fragmentation detonated within feet of his cockpit, shredding the airframe and killing him instantly. The surviving Syrians reacted predictably. They scattered, breaking formation as each pilot tried to evade the unseen threat. Some dove for the deck, hoping to lose themselves in the ground clutter. Others turned hard, trying to present a more difficult target. None of them understood yet that they were flying into a trap. Nachumi launched his own missile 3 seconds after Dubi's, targeting a MiG that had broken left. The weapon tracked true, and another Syrian aircraft tumbled out of the sky, trailing smoke and debris. But now the Syrians were aware of the threat, and they were closing fast. At 15 miles, the first Syrian missiles began to launch. The AA-2 Atoll was a Soviet copy of the American Sidewinder, a heat-seeking weapon that was deadly at short range but relatively easy to defeat with proper maneuvering. Nachumi called the warning, Eagle 2, missiles inbound, break left and deploy flares. Doobie's response was instant. His F-15 rolled 90 degrees and pulled hard, dispensing a stream of magnesium flares that bloomed in the sky like artificial stars. The Syrian missiles, confused by the multiple heat sources, wavered and lost. Lock. Meanwhile, the flanking element was in position. Eagle 1. This is Eagle 3. Shyman's voice was calm, almost bored. We have visual on the southern element. Engaging now. From their position 2,000 feet above and 5 miles north, Shyman and Ran had a perfect view of the chaos unfolding below. A group of 8 MiGs had broken south, trying to swing around the Israeli formation and attack from behind. They had no idea that 2 F-15s were watching them, already locked on and ready to fire. Shyman's first missile caught a MiG in the midst of a climbing turn. The impact tore the aircraft's wing off at the root, sending it into an uncontrollable spin. His second missile, launched just 4 seconds later, destroyed another MiG before its pilot could even react to his wingman's death. Ran, flying Eagle 4, had been given the responsibility of coordinating the battle and calling out threats. But when he saw 2 MiGs breaking toward Shyman's tail, he didn't hesitate. Rolled into a diving attack, closing the distance with afterburner blazing, and locked his radar onto the lead bandit. His first air-to-air kill came at a range of 2 miles, close enough that he could see the Syrian pilot's face through the canopy as the missile detonated. The second MiG, seeing its leader die, broke hard and ran for home. Ran let it go. There were plenty more targets to engage. Back at the center of the fight, Nachumi and Doobie were fully engaged in the swirling melee that veterans call a furball. At these ranges, the sophisticated BVR capabilities of the F-15 were less relevant. This was close-quarters combat, where skill and instinct mattered more than technology. Nachumi rolled onto the tail of a MiG-21 that was trying to line up a shot on Doobie. The Syrian pilot was good, using his aircraft's legendary maneuverability to throw off Nachumi's aim. But the F-15 had something the MiG lacked: raw power. Nachumi selected his AIM-9 Sidewinder, waited for the tone, indicating infrared lock, and fired. The missile covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. The MiG disintegrated, its pilot ejecting at the last moment and floating down toward the Lebanese mountains on a parachute that would likely save his life but end his war. The first engagement lasted just under 4 minutes. When the surviving Syrian aircraft finally broke off and ran for home, they left 8 of their comrades behind. 8 aircraft destroyed against no Israeli losses, but the battle was far from over. Control to Eagle Flight, second wave incoming, bearing 085, distance 60 miles. Formation strength appears to be 12 to 15 aircraft. Nachumi checked his fuel and weapons status. They had used perhaps a third of their missiles and were still well within acceptable fuel parameters. He made a quick decision. Eagle Flight, reform, execute Ambush Bravo. We're doing this again. Ambush Bravo was a variation they had developed for situations where the enemy was approaching from a different angle. Instead of a horizontal flanking maneuver, it called for a vertical separation, with one pair climbing high while the other dropped low. The effect was the same. The enemy would be caught between 2 fires, unable to defend against both simultaneously. The second Syrian wave was better organized than the first. Their pilots had been warned about the Israeli tactics, and they approached in a tighter formation, hoping to present a more difficult target. But organization could not compensate for the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement. The F-15 simply saw further and hit harder than anything the Syrians had. This time, Shimon drew first blood. Flying at 40,000 feet, nearly invisible against the blue sky, he watched the Syrian formation approach through the gaps in the clouds below. He picked his target carefully, a MiG flying slightly apart from the main formation, probably a squadron leader or experienced pilot who had more situational awareness than his wingmen. The Sparrow caught him from directly above, descending at an angle the MiG's radar couldn't detect. The aircraft came apart in mid-air, and suddenly the Syrian formation was thrown into chaos again. Over the next 6 minutes, Eagle Flight engaged and destroyed 7 more Syrian aircraft. The coordination that had seemed so theoretical during those midnight training sessions now flowed naturally, each pilot knowing exactly what his wingmen were doing without needing to be told. When Duby's radar jammed momentarily, Nachumi smoothly took over the targeting sequence without missing a beat. When Ran ran low on missiles, Shimon covered him while he conserved his remaining weapons for only the highest priority targets. By the time the second wave disengaged, the Bekaa Valley was littered with wreckage. Syrian search and rescue helicopters would spend the next several days recovering pilots and bodies from the mountainous terrain. And still, its view wasn't over. The Syrian High Command, watching their air force being dismantled in real time, made a desperate decision. They would throw everything they had at the Israeli fighters, hoping to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. At 14:45 hours, a third wave launched from air bases deep in Syrian territory. This one was the largest yet. Over 30 aircraft, including not just MiG-21s but also the more advanced MiG-23 Flogger. Control to all units. Massive bandit formation inbound. Estimated 30-plus aircraft. All available fighters vector to engage. Nachumi heard the call and felt something he hadn't experienced since the Yom Kippur War. Genuine fear. Not for himself, but for the consequences of failure. If the Syrian mass attack broke through, they could wreak havoc on the Israeli strike aircraft still operating over the SAM sites. The entire operation could unravel. But fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He pushed it aside and focused on the problem. Eagle Flight, we're going to split the formation. Eagles 1 and 2 will engage the northern element. Eagles 3 and 4 take the southern group. Remember your training. Trust each other, and let's finish this. What followed was the most intense aerial combat of Nachumi's career. The Syrian formation was too large to ambush effectively. Instead, Eagle Flight had to fight a running battle, engaging targets of opportunity while constantly maneuvering to avoid being overwhelmed. Nachumi found himself in a turning fight with 2 MiG-23s. Their variable geometry wings swept back for maximum speed. The Flogger was a more dangerous opponent than the MiG-21, with better radar and longer-range missiles. But Nachumi had spent years studying this aircraft, understanding its strengths and weaknesses. He knew that the MiG-23's turn rate degraded significantly at high altitude, while the F-15 remained agile regardless of altitude. He pulled his aircraft into a steep climb, trading speed for position. Von Ratterthing, MiG-23s followed, their pilots not yet realizing the trap they were flying into. At 45,000 feet, with his airspeed dropping toward the edge of controllability, Nachumi performed a maneuver he had practiced 1,000 times but never used in combat. He let his nose drop, converting his altitude back into speed, then pulled hard into a diving turn that brought him behind both MiG-23s in a single sweeping motion. The first pilot never had a chance. Nachumi's Sidewinder caught his aircraft squarely in the engine exhaust, detonating the fuel tanks and creating a fireball that briefly rivaled the afternoon sun. The second MiG-23 broke hard, trying to escape, but Duby was already there. He had followed Nachumi's climb, anticipating the maneuver, and positioned himself to cut off any escape route. His missile caught the fleeing Syrian at 2 miles range. On the southern side of the battle, Shimon and Ran were facing their own crisis. They had engaged a group of 8 MiGs, but had become separated when a third element appeared unexpectedly from the east. Ran found himself alone against 3 aircraft, with Shimon too far away to provide immediate support. What happened next would become legendary within the IAF. Ran, barely 24 years old, with less than 6 months of combat experience, faced 3 experienced Syrian pilots who smelled blood. They coordinated their attack, trying to bracket him, to leave him no escape route. It was exactly the situation every fighter pilot dreads. But Ran remembered his training. He remembered the hours spent discussing energy management, positional awareness, the geometry of multi-aircraft engagements. Instead of panicking, he thought, he couldn't defeat 3 aircraft in a turning fight. But he didn't have to. All he had to do was survive long enough for Shimon to reach him. He reversed his turn, pulling into a maneuver so violent that his vision began to gray at the edges from the G-forces. The sudden change caught the lead Syrian off guard, ruining his firing solution. Rand kept reversing, using the F-15's superior roll rate to keep his attackers guessing, never giving them a stable shot. 20 seconds. That's all he needed. Shimon arrived like divine intervention. His first missile destroyed the trailing MiG before its pilot knew he was there. His second forced another MiG to break off its attack, its pilot suddenly more concerned with survival than with killing the young Israeli. The third MiG, now alone and facing 2 F-15s, ran for home. He almost made it. Ran, his blood up, pursued with afterburner blazing. At 5 miles from the Syrian border, he achieved lock and fired his last missile. The MiG went down trailing smoke, its pilot ejecting over what he probably hoped was friendly territory. When Eagle Flight finally received permission to return to base at 15:30 hours, they had been in continuous combat for nearly 90 minutes. Nachumi led his formation westward, 4 aircraft, that had faced nearly 50 of the enemy and emerged without a scratch. Behind them, the skies over the Bekaa Valley were finally clear. The debrief lasted until well after midnight. Intelligence officers meticulously reconstructed every engagement, matching radar tracks to pilot reports, confirming kills and near misses. When the final tally was complete, Eagle Flight was credited with 23 confirmed air-to-air kills. 23 Syrian aircraft destroyed in a single afternoon by 4 pilots using a tactic that had been officially rejected by the IAF High Command. Colonel Ivry was present for the debrief. He listened in silence as Nachumi walked through each phase of the battle, explaining how the 4-ship ambush had allowed them to achieve local superiority, despite being outnumbered 5 or 6 to 1. When Nachumi finished, Ivry stood. "Lieutenant Colonel Nachumi," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been humility. "It appears I owe you an apology. Your tactics have proven themselves beyond any doubt. Effective immediately, all F-15 squadrons will begin training in your formation protocols." The room erupted in applause. Nachumi stood there, exhausted beyond words, and felt tears forming at the corners of his eyes. Not tears of pride, though he had earned that right. Tears of relief. The men who had trusted him, who had practiced his unproven theories in secret for 18 months, had survived. They had won. But the cost of that day extended far beyond the immediate battle. Operation Mole Cricket. 19 was a complete success. Every major Syrian SAM site in the Bekaa Valley was destroyed, along with 86 Syrian aircraft in total, without the loss of a single Israeli jet. It was one of the most one-sided aerial victories in the history of warfare. The implications were profound. Military theorists around the world studied the battle, trying to understand how such a lopsided result had been achieved. Some pointed to technology, particularly the Israeli use of drones and precision-guided munitions. Others emphasized training and doctrine. A few noticed the 4-ship ambush and began to understand what Nachumi had known all along. The age of the individual fighter ace was over. From now on, victory would belong to those who could coordinate, who could fight as unified teams rather than collections of individuals. The tactics pioneered by Nachumi and his pilots would be adopted and refined by air forces around the world. They would influence the development of new aircraft, new weapons, and new training programs. Nachumi himself would go on to become one of the most decorated pilots in IAF history. He rose to command his own squadron, then served in increasingly senior positions within the Air Force. He trained a new generation of pilots in the tactics he had developed, ensuring that his legacy would endure long after he retired. But he never forgot the lesson of those years in the wilderness. The lesson that sometimes being right isn't enough. You have to be willing to fight for what you believe, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. You have to be willing to work in the shadows, to practice and prepare for an opportunity that might never come. And when that opportunity finally arrives, you have to be ready to seize it with both hands. The four pilots of Eagle Flight remained close for the rest of their lives. They gathered every year on June 9th, the anniversary of the battle, to remember what they had accomplished and to honor those who hadn't been as fortunate. At these gatherings, they would tell stories, laugh at old jokes, and raise glasses to absent friends. Doobie eventually became a commercial airline pilot, trading the cockpit of a fighter jet for the calmer skies of civilian aviation. He said that after the Bekaa Valley, nothing else in the air would ever feel quite as alive. Shimon retired from the Air Force in 1990, carrying scars both visible and invisible. He spent his later years teaching young pilots at the IAF Flight Academy, passing on the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime spent in the sky. Ran, the youngest of the four, had the longest military career. He rose through the ranks to become a general officer, responsible for training and doctrine throughout the Israeli Air Force. He never forgot the moment when he faced 3 enemy aircraft alone, with nothing but his training and his faith in his wingman to keep him alive. And Nachumi himself, the man who had seen what needed to be done when no one else could see it, who had fought for his vision against skepticism and indifference, who had proven himself right on the most consequential day of his life, he lived long enough to see his ideas become the foundation of modern air combat doctrine. He watched as the principles of the four-ship ambush were adopted by air forces around the world, modified and improved, but always traceable back to those secret training sessions in the Israeli night. When he finally passed away, his funeral was attended by hundreds of pilots from every generation of the IAF. They came to honor a man who had changed the way the world thought about aerial warfare. But more than that, they came to honor a man who had proven that one person's vision, combined with determination and courage, could change history. The skies over the Bekaa Valley are peaceful now. The SAM sites that once threatened Israeli aircraft have been gone for decades. The MiGs that filled the sky on that June afternoon are museum pieces, relics of a Cold War that has faded from memory. But the lessons of that day endure. Lessons about the importance of innovation, about the necessity of challenging conventional wisdom, about the power of teamwork and trust. Lessons about what can happen when 4 men refuse to accept that something can't be done and set out to prove the world wrong. 23 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single day. 4 pilots who came home to their families. One man's vision vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable. That is the legacy of the four-ship ambush. That is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Amir Nachumi and the men who believed in him. And that is why 4 decades later, military academies around the world still study what happened over the Bekaa Valley on June 9, 1982. Not because it was the largest aerial battle of the modern era, though it was. Not because it represented a turning point in military technology, though it did, but because it proved something that matters far more than any of that. It proved that courage and conviction, combined with skill and preparation, can overcome any odds. It proved that one person, with the right idea at the right time, can change the course of history. And it proved that sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the maverick who refuses to give up is the one who saves the day. The Syrian Air Force never recovered from the losses it suffered during Operation Mole Cricket 19. The defeat was so complete, so psychologically devastating, that Syrian pilots became reluctant to engage Israeli aircraft for years afterward. The balance of power in the Middle Eastern skies, already tilted in Israel's favor, shifted decisively and permanently. In the halls of the Pentagon and the headquarters of NATO, analysts pored over every detail of the battle. They were particularly interested in the coordinated tactics used by Israeli F-15 pilots, tactics that seemed to multiply the effectiveness of each individual aircraft. Some of these analysts would go on to develop the training programs that American pilots would use a decade later during the Gulf War, programs that owed a direct debt to Nachumi's innovations. The F-15 itself was vindicated as one of the greatest air superiority fighters ever built. McDonnell Douglas, its manufacturer, would use the Bekaa Valley results in marketing materials for years, pointing to the aircraft's perfect combat record as proof of its capabilities. But those who understood aerial warfare knew that the jet was only part of the story. Without the right pilots, the right training, and the right tactics, even the best aircraft is just an expensive piece of metal. History sometimes turns on moments that seem insignificant at the time. a briefing where a junior officer speaks up against conventional wisdom. A commander who decides, against his better judgment, to give an unproven idea a chance. 4 pilots who trusted each other enough to fly into overwhelming odds. These are the moments that change everything, and they rarely come with advance warning. Nachumi understood this better than most. In his later years, when he spoke to young pilots about his experiences, he always returned to the same theme. Preparation, he would say, is everything. You can't know when your moment will come. You can only make sure that when it does, you're ready. He had spent 18 months preparing for a battle that might never have happened. He had practiced tactics in secret, risking his career on the chance that someday someone would give him permission to prove himself. When that chance came, he was ready. That readiness made all the difference. The morning after the battle, as the sun rose over Ramat David Air Base, Nachumi walked alone to the flight line. His F-15 sat where it had been parked the night before, its ground crew already at work preparing it for another mission. There were new marks on the fuselage, small Syrian flags painted below the cockpit. 1 for each kill. He stood there for a long time, looking at those flags. Each one represented a life ended, a family somewhere in Syria that would never see their son or husband or father again. War was brutal, and victory came at a terrible price. But he also knew that those same pilots would have killed him and his wingmen without hesitation. They had been doing their duty, just as he had been doing his. In the calculus of war, there was no room for sentiment, only for doing everything in your power to bring your people home alive. He had done that, against all odds, against the doubts of his superiors, against the weight of conventional wisdom. He had brought his people home, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. Years later, when military historians wrote about the Lebanon War, they would describe Operation Mole Cricket 19 as a perfect example of combined arms warfare. They would analyze the integration of electronic warfare, drone technology, precision munitions, and manned fighters into a coherent operational concept. They would credit Israeli intelligence for accurately predicting Syrian responses and Israeli commanders for executing the plan flawlessly. All of this was true, but it missed the human element that made the victory possible. It missed the pilots who flew into danger again and again, trusting their training and each other. It missed the ground crews who worked through the night to keep the aircraft flying. It missed the intelligence officers who pieced together the enemy's capabilities from fragments of information. It missed the commanders who made difficult decisions under pressure, balancing risk against reward. And it missed one stubborn lieutenant colonel who refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the way they had to be done. Innovation doesn't come from committees or consensus. It comes from individuals who see something others don't, who are willing to fight for their vision even when everyone tells them they're wrong. Sometimes those individuals fail and their ideas are forgotten. But sometimes, when the moment is right and preparation meets opportunity, they change the world. Amir Nachumi changed the world. Not because he was the smartest pilot in the Israeli Air Force or the bravest or the most politically connected. He changed it because he had an idea. He believed in it completely, and he never, ever gave up. The 4-ship ambush lives on today in the doctrine of air forces around the world. The pilots who fly F-35s and Eurofighters and Rafales probably don't know where their tactics originated. They don't know about the midnight training sessions over the Israeli desert, or the skeptical commanders, or the young pilot who almost died over the Bekaa Valley before his wingman saved him. But that's okay. Ideas have a way of outgrowing their creators. The tactics Nachumi developed have been refined and improved by generations of pilots who came after him. They've been adapted to new aircraft, new weapons, new threats. They've evolved in ways Nachumi himself might not recognize. But at their core, they still embody the same principles he believed in all those years ago: coordination, trust, the willingness to subordinate individual glory to collective success. The understanding that in the chaos of combat, the team that works together will defeat the collection of individuals every time. These are timeless principles. They applied to aerial combat in 1982, and they apply to challenges far beyond the battlefield today. In business, in science, in any field where people work together toward a common goal, the lessons of the four-ship ambush remain relevant. Work as a team, trust your colleagues, prepare for the moments that matter, and never ever give up on the ideas you believe in. The sun sets early in December, even in the Middle East. By late afternoon, the sky over what was once the Bekaa Valley battlefield turns golden, then orange, then deepy purple. Shepherds herd their flocks toward home. Farmers return from their fields. Life goes on, as it always does, regardless of the history that was made in these skies. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of that long-ago battle. Pieces of wreckage buried in the soil. Craters where missiles struck. Old men in villages who remember seeing aircraft fall from the sky like burning leaves. They remember the thunder of jet engines and the distant crackle of gunfire. They remember looking up to see contrails crisscrossing the heavens as machines beyond their comprehension fought and died overhead. They remember the day when everything changed. And in Israel, at air bases and military academies, at reunion dinners and memorial services, they remember too. They remember the pilots who proved that courage and innovation could overcome any odds. They remember the commander who gave an unproven tactic a chance when no one else would. They remember the day when 4 F-15s faced an army in the sky and emerged victorious. They remember Amir Nachumai, the man who wouldn't take no for an answer, the man who proved everyone wrong, the man who changed history with a vision no one else could see. This is his story. This is their story, and now it's part of yours too. Remember it the next time someone tells you something can't be done. Remember it the next time the experts say, your ideas are impractical, your vision is unrealistic, your ambition is too big. Remember what happened when one man refused to give up, and remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the crazy ones are right.